So, welcome to the final lecture in this course, The Dark Shadows of the Jolly Green Giants. I just want to check you can hear my sound okay, if someone can let me know. Okay, that's great. Let's make a start. So, over the last 5 weeks, we have covered a wide range of the most important renewable energy technologies, really. We started off showing why we need energy because of the second law of thermodynamics. So energy is continually lost or dissipated from everything, and therefore we need to gain energy continually. And the fundamental way we do this is to eat food, obviously. But as man has advanced, woman has advanced through time, what we find is that we've started to use energy for luxury consumption as well as for essential consumption. And this has really got out of control now. And we've got so many luxuries and we're using vast amounts of energy. We used to just get our energy from biomass, but now we've had to use fossil fuels and we're digging these fuels up from beneath the surface of the earth, from the oceans, and we are burning them. And as a result, we have a lot of toxic chemicals being released into the atmosphere, some of which lead to climate destabilization, others lead to things like asthma, and yet others will have an effect on the ozone layer. So there are all sorts of nasty chemicals that are released here. And what we find is basically that each one of the renewable energy technologies has got issues related to it as well. So while we're getting rid of the carbon and some of these nasty other particulate matter and so on that can lead to asthma, we're creating other problems. So it can be clearly seen that the portfolio of renewable energy technologies poses multiple significant threats to a truly sustainable future. And that's really what my paper was all about when I wrote it. The social and environmental damage from supply chain issues and waste can clearly be seen. And this impact is affecting many people from well beyond our shores. So we're externalizing the damage to other parts of the world in order to have so-called renewable energy. Now, combined with these problems is another really worrying thing, and that is that the plans are to massively expand renewable energy technologies. And this is being preached left, right, and centre. And of course, we can see why we need to do this, because climate change is extremely problematic, or climate destabilization, as I prefer to call it, and will threaten the supply chains, not just of our products, but actually, more importantly, of our food. And that is a considerable worry. So we do need to address the CO2 levels in the atmosphere and so on, the methane levels, etc. However, combined with the underlying issues across these technologies, these renewable technologies, as we've just seen, if we go for this massive expansion, this is a recipe for disaster. And so right now is a critical moment before we magnify the problem hugely and mass produce our errors and let this thing spiral out of control. We see here that the plans set out in policies in Europe, for example, show a massive increase in things like battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. And this is really, really quite worrying because we can see the problems that are associated with these various technologies. And of course, not just are we worried about the damage these things are doing, but we're also concerned we're going to run out of the crucial chemicals needed for this technology, things like lithium, cobalt, and copper. And even if we manage to get the supply chains not damaging the indigenous people and the habitats there, even if we manage that, we'd still have a huge deficit. And we can see these deficits are kicking in quite soon, really. And this is going to be very problematic. The market forecaster Roskill predicts graphite demand from battery makers will grow by maybe 25% each year, And this will also lead to really major problems because we will run out of graphite. And this is a crucial chemical for the production of these batteries, electric batteries. But there are deeper issues as well, just as well as running out of stuff, as we've said. There's a lack of transparency in the supply chains. There's a lack of accountability. We can't make any kind of ethical judgment because we haven't got the information to base that on. And we're sort of being not told crucial information. And I know many of you have been quite shocked at some of the things we've looked at over the course of this course. But actually, that's a really significant problem, and whether it's deliberate or accidental, it needs to be corrected. There are precarious supply chains. The geopolitics linked to supply chains is fundamentally worrying. There are unacceptable impacts on children, on indigenous people, and no effort seems to be being made to, circumvent these problems, to look for alternatives. And don't forget, there are plenty of alternatives, as we've seen. Plenty of alternatives available to stop this kind of supply chain rot that lies at the heart of so many of these technologies. But actually, much more fundamental issues underpin all of this. And that's what we need to really look at. It's not just about fixing little bit by little bit. I often say when you get measles, you don't sort of get surgically remove every spot of the measles all over your body, because that's not going to fix it, because the problem lies much deeper within, and we need to address that problem rather than address the symptoms as such. And so it's a matter of teasing apart the causes and the consequences in order to find what cures we really need. So in the measles example, the consequences are the spots, but the causes are much deeper than that, a viral particle. And therefore the cure has to attack the viral particle and not the spots. And so we need to delve down and see, well, why are we behaving like this? And why is this renewable energy sort of technology approach really coming up with so many problems? There are reasons for this. First of all, we have a fixation with carbon, and we're not trading off between all of the other demands that we are creating, because the planet is falling apart in many ways, not just through carbon destabilization. And some of these are extraordinarily serious, as we've mentioned before. Our ignorance of supply chains, we've mentioned before as well. We're not being able to make the ethical judgments ourselves because we haven't been given ownership. We haven't been empowered with the necessary information that we can use then to make our own decisions. And big business is a large part of this, of course. And big business is profit driven fundamentally, and therefore needs to be encouraged by the consumer to make the right choices and decisions. But if we are being prevented from knowing what's lying behind our supply chains, then that's really problematic. We've also got this desire for business as usual. Well, let's make the same amount of energy, but make it in a green way, and therefore we can continue on our merry little way. But actually, the business as usual model isn't good enough, because the energy we make, it's creating problems in what we use it for, not just in how we make the energy in the first place. And therefore, we need to address this much more fundamental issue of massively reducing our energy use. And this is going to take a complete change rather than just a little tweaking of where we get our energy from. And finally, there's an ignorance of the Earth system fundamentally, how complex it is and how it is emergent, how it's non-linear, how it relies on constant feedback, how it is self-organizing, and how it is suboptimal at every level. And we ignore all of this and we optimize for the human condition, which is a very foolish thing to do. So I said it's not just carbon stupid. We see these chains here, and if we imagine each of these chains represents one part of the damage that we're doing, there's no point in fixing one loop in this chain, basically, and then the others are all left to break, because then the chain itself will be broken. we need to address all of them. So we need to address soil erosion, salinization, eutrophication, and the global biodiversity collapse, as well as climate destabilization. And we need to address them all at once. And, we can do this, but it's not just the fact that we can do it, we actually have to do it if we're going to stand any chance of continuing our time on the planet as a species. So it's not just carbon stupid, and carbon fixation is detracting from the bigger picture. As the old saying, you can't see the wood for the trees. And this is really an interesting analogy, really, because what we need to do is actually have a much broader ecological view of things. And that comes from understanding the Earth system, of course. So we have to plug all the holes in the boat before we can start bailing the boat out. Otherwise, we're lost. You can plug 1, 2, 3, 4, but we need to plug all 5 or all the holes that there are if we're going to have any chance. And on this boat and holes analogy, we've also got to beware of externalization. We're creating all of these problems in other countries and we're exporting the products into our country, but we're all on the one ship ultimately, and so damage anywhere in the planet will lead to damage to the overall system. And so there's no point in sitting at one end of the boat and saying, I'm sure glad the hole isn't at our end. Another really irritating thing is that we are sold this idea that GDP, or the gross domestic product, is some great virility symbol of the success that we have. And, because our GDP is high, it means we're great, we're doing everything perfectly, and we're really successful. And this is a huge false sense of well-being here, because actually, the higher the GDP, the greater the environmental damage, and therefore, if we were to properly factor in the success of our economy relative to the success of the Earth system, high GDP means terrible performance. It means, disastrous performance. And some of the poorest countries in the world have got a very low GDP, but are really having very little negative effect on the planet. And this is exactly the opposite with most of the Western northern nations, of course. So there's a complete lack of environmental accounting of international supply chains, and there's no attempt to subtract environmental and sociological costs from production to get some kind of net measure of our economy in terms of the financial benefits of that economy, but also the financial costs of that economy. And this needs to happen urgently if we're really going to have a realistic expression of how well we're actually doing in terms of building a future that we're actually part of. And we can see this global GDP here rising up the free trade and globalization machine, sucking in natural resources, sucking in cheap labor, pumping out consumer goods, and polluting and destroying the environment. And it's all looking all wonderful if we just focus on this number up here. But if we look at the underlying sort of impacts, consequences of this great free trade and globalization machine, we see that it's actually really not at all fit for purpose. And this is a really serious problem. We've talked about supply chains quite a bit in this course, and they disappear off into the mist. We don't see the impacts they're having, but we need to be aware of this. And actually, a lot of the modern remote sensing and artificial intelligence can be used to inform us of all of this in real time and the impact of these supply chains on social and environmental well-being. And therefore, that is really critically important. And this is a hugely significant issue that these supply chains are no longer disappearing off into the mist. We clear the mist away, the smoke and the mirrors, and we actually see the real cost of our products. And this drives us, of course, then towards considering localism. Got a new paper coming out in the new year all about that. So you imagine this couple in a nice Western world restaurant here, and they're sitting down to a meal, and it's really nice. They've got all the nice surroundings and food and the nice clothes and everything. It looks like a dream kind of date here. But then this little guy appears, and he's the ethical conscience of the planet. And lo and behold, he's got a flat screen TV, and he shows the consequences of the lifestyle that we're enjoying here. And a lot of child labor, a lot of poverty, and very, very low wages, and so on. And suddenly, it's not such an awesome evening at all. And we see more and more of these images being brought up by the ethical conscience of the planet. And again, we're seeing children now in very dangerous working conditions. Some of these mines, for instance, these African mines of cobalt. And then we see these dangerous factories in Asia, for example, where we've got no fire escapes. They're all blocked. They're packed and crowded to make these nice clothes that these people are wearing. And we see the terrible outcomes of this. Fire has spread through this factory and killed many people. Can you imagine the smell of this burning factory drifting over their table now and making them aware of what's actually going on? Because you see, what people like is to put on these supply chain magic glasses, and this is what the marketing departments want you to do. So this lady's being told by the manufacturer, now you'll be able to see exactly what marketing sees, because these glasses will look at the chain and blind out most of what you see and make it all look very beautiful and fantastic. And that's the marketing of products that we have all around us. But you know, if these adverts, a bit like our diners there, actually included the supply chain details, it wouldn't be so amazing at all, quite possibly. And so we want to know about this. It's not comfortable, but we want to know about this. And we all want to know about this so we can make the right decisions. And this goes for renewable energies as well, hence the title of this course and the paper. And we see that there's toxic leaching, there's child labour and deaths, there's displacement of indigenous people because they've run out of water because it's all being used to produce lithium. There is a landfill explosion of glass fibres and electric vehicle batteries not being recycled, and then the huge photovoltaic panels. There's geopolitical interference in supply chains, and there are health issues around the mines. There's greenwashing. So we see that actually there's all these problems here, all these problems linked to the Jolly Green Giant. It's quite funny because the guy who played the Jolly Green Giant in the very first set of adverts also played Darth Vader. And maybe that tells us a little bit more about this whole thing. So at the heart of the sustainability theory, there are flaws. We're trying to maintain the status quo. We're trying to keep it all going the way it's always been, or the way we've got used to it being recently. And we'll do that while greenwashing, while fooling ourselves possibly. Or at least that's what the marketing people are trying to tell us. You can have this lifestyle, but look, we've tweaked this and we've tweaked that and we've altered this. And so it's really green now and it's all fine. But that's not the case at all. Any ecologist will tell you that. And so the message has to be reduce, reduce, reduce. That must be the mantra. Otherwise, we are destined to have lots and lots of problems still here, even though we feel that we're living this green lifestyle now. Our activities must strengthen the Earth system as a bottom line, not just reduce the damage to the Earth system. So we have to be in resonance with it, and we'll discuss this a bit later on. And if we want to be resonating with the Earth system, then we need an economic model that is embedded within the Earth system. And so the economy should be working as a servant to society and the environment, leaving no one and nothing behind. So this is a re-envisioning of the circular economy, which is the sort of dominant green economy concept at the minute. And we've been, myself and some colleagues have been really, attacking this actually and setting out the flaws of it, and then also the importance of altering our approach to economics. And we set out an economic model we wrote in 2017, wherein planning, resourcing, procurement, production, and reprocessing are designed and managed as both process and output to maximize ecosystem functioning and human well-being. And this paper appeared in the Journal of Business Ethics, and it'll be on your reading list at the end of the lecture. So it's an embedded economy, not a circular economy. And it's bio-participation, not biomimicry. I'm really object to the term biomimicry. We're not mimicking little bits of nature and taking them like little building blocks and putting them onto our current little Lego model. We're not doing that because that doesn't get us anywhere, because that's decontextualizing it onto a reductionist approach. The Earth system is emergent, and we need to work within it, not take little bits of it in order to make our lives better, in order to optimize for the human condition. That is completely going to lead us to disastrous outcomes. And this is some of the fundamental causes I was talking about, not the consequences of the mess we're in. The causes are these kind of ideas of us being in charge and us building our way out of the problem with some reductionist silo thinking. And that is not the way to go at all. So biomimicry is not the way to go. It's bioparticipation, and therefore we need to face up to the problem rather than stepping around the side and mimicking it. We need to step out of the play. It's not a stage play, it's the real world, and therefore it's important to actually address that. And I put it this way: we must step out of the big top of human-centered thinking and get into the real world here, and step into a meaningful integration through the relational self. Now, this is often referred to as beyond human, this idea of the human and the implications of the human and its activities, and how its social context and its environmental context play in together. And actually, the beyond human really has to become the human. And what we're situated in when we're in this kind of big top, this whole mimicry situation, is being less than human, because the original human condition was contextualized within the environment and society. It was contextualized already. So it wasn't beyond human, it was actually human. The human is a relational self. And therefore, we also need to consider humans in all of this too, because we're not only destroying the planet, but what gets less said really is we're impacting on each other. And not just indirectly through the environment, where the environment will lead to huge turmoil and a massive increase in environmental migrants forced from their land because of floods or drought. But we're affecting the resources of these people, and we're forcing them into working in conditions that are horrific because we're creating a market for these products, and we're not stopping them from coming from the child labor mines of the Democratic Republic of Congo, or the highly toxic rare earth metal mines in China, for instance. So we need to be aware of this. Another terrible, terrible cost is the murder of indigenous environmental activists. In 2020, there were 227 activists. These were mostly indigenous community leaders. They were striving to do no more than protect their people from multinational companies polluting their land, air, and water, destroying their forests, and desecrating their sacred sites to produce products that we are taking. And they were killed. And this is up from 116 in 2014 and 212 in 2019. So this is an increasing number of activists who are being killed. And let's meet a few of them. This is Fikele Nchangasa, and she was shot dead in her living room at the age of 65. She's one of the 227. And all she had done was oppose the expansion of an open cast mine that would have destroyed her ancestral home. She was a beautiful, caring woman who cared passionately for her community and for her environment. And she was shot dead in her own home because of this. This is Oscar Adams. He was shot dead in Baja California in Mexico, aged only 34. He led a campaign to protect the water supply of his community from industrial extraction by a very famous beer company. You see, this water extraction is a really big thing. You see it in lithium mines as well. And it destroys the local habitats. It means there isn't clean, available water for them or for their livestock. And this is Berta Cáceres. She's from Honduras. She won the Goldman Environmental Prize, and she led protests against the Agua Zarca hydroelectric dam that was being built, but was going to destroy her ancestral areas and important areas for the people in this region. And she was shot dead in her home. An absolute tragedy. And her grave site is highly respected among the local people. They come regularly to clean it and to put fresh flowers there. And this Resistencia Honduras, led by the people who loved Berta Cáceres so much, and what they did was they have got this saying now, volveré y seré millones, which means I will return and I will be millions. So there's a huge human cost in so many different ways, and so many really wonderful, wonderful people are being killed because they're standing up for these issues. That is totally unacceptable. Optimization is a large part of the problem as well, of course. We are optimizing. We've seen the squirrel app, the nut app, if the squirrel optimized for getting all the nuts, well, it would be a really stupid thing because the entire ecosystem would collapse. But we're doing exactly that. We need less optimal energy systems if they're going to actually not destroy the environment, because all of the components in a complex system must be suboptimal for the complex system to function. And so by optimizing, then we are actually destroying the very essence of being a system. And so it's totally counterproductive. And this whole concept of, we're optimizing because nature is eco-optimal. Eco-efficiency is this great saying. It's completely wrong. Nature is extremely wasteful. And I've spelled this out in a number of papers over the years. And it's a very important point to grasp. And actually, if we make these systems less efficient, then we have the luxury of not having to have cobalt and lithium and graphite being used at huge levels. We wouldn't have all the turbine rotor waste, the plastic turbine rotor waste, and we could have smaller, less efficient hydro turbines using less rare earth metals. And this makes it much more local, lower tech, but actually is ideal for a system because it's not hyper efficient. And it's not about profit, it's about function and functioning in a way that the system will work. And we can demand this, of course. But the problem is that big business dominates renewable energy as it does all of the resource acquisition side of things. Big business may not have killed these wonderful people that we've just talked about, but it sets itself up with promises of great wealth for the local people. And then those local people feel that these other activists are going to stop them from getting rich, from finding the dream life that they're being promised by big business when these businesses move into an area to exploit it. And therefore, some of them unfortunately kill the people who are trying to protect the environment and actually protect their own sustainability. Big businesses are optimized for profit, and they're really the supply chain issues here. They won't want to really advertise those necessarily unless they're forced to, because basically, if you can get the stuff made cheap, whatever the costs are socially and environmentally, then you can make more profit out of it, profit at any cost. And therefore, the more fog, the better. There are businesses now changing completely and becoming a lot more honest about this, but some of them are just greenwashing it. So we need to have systems set up and policies that actually insist on the transparency of the supply chains. I've talked about localism in previous courses and will continue to talk about it in future courses. Localism is very, very important, and it plays a significant role in energy provision as well. So having distributed energy rather than utility energy, i.e. each little village or each little set of houses is gaining its energy more locally. And that means then that they're not needing these massive constructions, these hyper efficient, environmentally damaging constructions of large power generation of whatever type that is. It avoids many of the issues related to large scale technology. And part of the greater benefit of this whole thing is local accountability and landscape culture links, in that we become aware of our local environment and therefore we become more respecting of it. And here we're seeing landscape as essence, really, as part of the human being, that this relational self. We start now really sort of recognizing that we are one with it all. And this really sharpens up our ethics. Now, historically, most towns and villages are located on rivers and streams. So, for instance, this sort of micro hydro idea is a very useful one in these situations. The other benefit is with a localism is that fuel poverty is less likely in connected local communities, and the forgotten ones are remembered, whereas they're not in some of these much larger scale situations. When you think of the electricity crisis we've had of late, if a lot of this was generated locally, we wouldn't be relying on it being piped in from afar. And therefore, if a storm came, it would be much more easy to get the local electricity generation up and running again. In fact, it mightn't even be damaged because it's not depending on these vulnerable above ground wiring and so on. So, this can be a really positive thing as well. As I say, it's all about reduction, reduction, reduction. It takes the pressure off this drive for efficiency, allows suboptimality to increase, along with environmentally and socially friendly approaches. Take agriculture. Agricultural food waste is about 40% from field to plate, and it contributes a large part of the greenhouse gas release and to nutrient pollution. So if we reduce this waste and we basically have a much more direct route to our food, and again, localism comes into that too, and eating seasonally available fruit and veg and so on, then we can massively impact the damage that occurs through agriculture. Energy waste reduction is another really important thing. The less energy we waste, the less we need to produce. So insulation, so vitally important. Improved industrial processes that are not wasting so much energy, or if any energy is released, then some of it is used to, supply other things that we need. Energy footprints for products is an essential thing as well, and agricultural barriers to prevent the runoff of a lot of these fertilizers. And that's really important because we apply fertilizers to the soil. 80% of the fertilizer we apply is lost and flows into the rivers and streams and oceans, killing the fish there and leading to toxic red tides. So if we prevent that and have these barriers, layers of shrubs such as lupins and nettles that absorb these nutrients up before they escape from the field, and then we apply those back onto the field as a mulch, then we're improving the soil as well. That'll improve the water holding capacity, leading to less irrigation being needed, and so on and so forth. And also, if we interplant our crops with, either trees and agroforestry or nitrogen producing plants and phosphorus releasing plants, then these plants can supply a lot of the fertilizer and we won't actually need to be spraying it on at all. And don't forget, it's not just the waste of the fertilizer, it's the cost of it in terms of energy. Nitrogen is hugely expensive to make, nitrogen fertilizer. And so we can cut down on that as well. And we can see that the problem recently with gas prices going up, the fertilizer plants are saying, we're going to have to charge a huge amount more for fertilizer. The farmers are going into a panic, saying this is going to make it too expensive to produce the food. And all of these problems could be alleviated if we didn't waste as much food and if we didn't put on as much fertilizer. And all of this could be done. And we could have fields that lie in pasture for a period. And that would be quite possible if we didn't waste so much food. So say 80% of the fertilizers are running off, having disastrous consequences. And this process is made even worse by climate destabilization. If we look here, we see the fertilizers running off into the rivers and lakes, rotting algae blooms, low oxygen conditions and odors, increased toxic bacteria, and dead fish. But climate destabilization can lead to increased rainfall, which leads to greater runoff into the rivers and lakes. It leads to a temperature rise, which leads to a rapidly increasing drop in oxygen through the algal blooms, and it leads to increased thermal stratification, which leads to increased oxygen depletion in deeper waters and leads to all of these problems here as well. So climate destabilization has a non-linear and positive feedback on the deadly impacts of fertilizer application. So again, this is all about this silo mentality. We're not connecting up, and one problem exacerbates the other, and so we need to address it all. We must shrink our ecological and sociological footprints, not our carbon footprints. And so I've been arguing only an embedded economy in resonance with the Earth system can deliver a brighter future, and ecological intelligence, not Western human intelligence here, is the key. We need to think as the Earth system thinks, not in the self-centered, egotistic way that we began to think during the latter part of the Enlightenment. It's easy also to point fingers at other countries. You know, people say, oh, China is the big problem here. But actually, when you look at the per capita release, and countries like Australia, Canada, and the United States, those three are by far and away the worst nations on earth per person. And then we got another group that are down there that are using quite a lot of energy, including ourselves, of course. And then we got another group that are using hardly any. You think of India, Brazil, Uganda, Rwanda, Chad, Somalia, Bangladesh. And you see that China is much lower than is the United States per person. It's way lower. It's less than half of the CO2 emissions compared to what we see in the States or in Australia. And we need to come back to this point that the basic metabolic rate of humans is really low, and the kind of industrial and post-industrial consumption is extraordinarily high. It's maybe 100 times higher. And so we need to start removing this luxury energy consumption because we don't need it to survive fundamentally. And therefore we need to bring it back down completely. And that can be done, of course, but it will take a complete revisionist approach in terms of how we actually live and how we go about our lives. This needs to be the priority rather than just an add-on. And so we see that as technology has increased, the consumption of energy has increased, particularly in terms of coal and oil, shooting and gas. You said that's the majority of the energy production now that we use. Biomass has stayed fairly constant through time, as we've seen. So you might say to me, well, surely this will increase the price of energy and goods. Well, paying a price that reflects the environmental costs can only be just. So we should be prepared to pay more for things. Fossil fuel subsidies currently stand at around $1 trillion per year. And so it's time to subsidize the recovery in the way that we subsidize the destruction. And that's a key thing. We put far less into renewable technologies and improving them than we do maintaining the fossil fuels. And don't forget, 80% of our energy still comes from fossil fuels. The G20 provide about 452 billion US dollars a year in subsidizing fossil fuel production. And this is 4 times what the entire world provides in subsidies to renewable energy. And it's more than 4 times the 100 billion that rich countries have pledged in annual support for climate action in poorer countries by 2020. So, you know, we're putting in way more into increasing the problem than we are into solving it. And the question came up earlier, you know, why on earth do we subsidize fossil fuels? Well, of course, it reduces the cost of energy while compensating energy companies. So basically, the consumer does get cheaper energy. And this is what these companies argue. We'd have to put the price way up unless we got these subsidies. And many of the governments are stuck between a rock and a hard place, basically, because of this. And of course, there's things like OPEC, which is basically a cartel, much like the Diamonds cartel, that are very carefully controlling the availability, and they can put the price up or down as they wish by decreasing or increasing the amount of fossil fuels. Recently, it's quite interesting because they want it to be cheap in order to make sure that renewable energies don't succeed too well, so that they're always more expensive than fossil fuels are. And we're actually subsidizing this as a country through our taxes via the government. But the rich benefit more than the poor. These energy companies and their shareholders, they're the ones really gaining the most wealth from these subsidies. So you're subsidizing their wealth through the taxes that we're paying. And these subsidies lead to greater damage of the environment. But there are great fears over fuel poverty. And the threat is always used, well, if we don't pay these subsidies, then we're not going to be able to supply cheap fuel, and therefore there will be an increased fuel poverty. And so it's a kind of catch-22 and a kind of threat that's used. And this cartoon really shows it well. President Macron, you are right, the climate has changed. And this was the Great Rebellion when Macron tried to pass through a climate change tax and a fuel tax to offset the damage that was being done and to raise money for being able to alleviate the crises. But now he finds himself in a kind of a Bastille situation here, and the climate has definitely changed. Improved designs are needed. We've mentioned this before. There is the ability to re-engineer these things. And as Professor Borthwick said, as we mentioned, I think a couple of weeks ago, as in the Industrial Revolution, a new generation of engineers is required that possesses the ingenuity and boldness to meet this global challenge. Designers and scientists need the funding to transform these energy technologies. And many of the solutions are already there. We've seen that. We just need a decrease in efficiency, and then that will work. And we need to understand that that's actually the right thing to do within a system. This relational self, we need to be thinking as a whole, not just in our own selfish requirements. And the point is that it's not as if this is new. Punch here, the great satirical cartoon magazine in 1858 showed the Grim Reaper stalking the Thames as the pollution levels rose there, the smog and the dead animals and so on in the water. And this was a call for a cleaner world in 1858. Herbert Bloch in this cartoon looked at the primeval forest, and it was all chopped down. And this was in 1929. He was addressing deforestation. So, you know, we've known about all of this for a very long time. The educated relational consumer, that's what we need here. This is the crux of the matter. The individual being educated and relational rather than operating as an individual. And it can both be a carrot and a stick. It can encourage companies to respond to our enlightened, embedded decision making. The relational self empowered by connectivity, this concept of Ubuntu that we find, that I am what we are. But it also will empower ourselves, and because we will then be connected and ethically thinking. And this is only a good thing in terms of a stronger society and the great benefits of that in terms of mental health and physical health, and also in terms of the environment and the great help that that provides for mental health and physical health. So this idea of Ubuntu, as I said, I am what we are. So if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And Ubuntu is made up of two words, enfolded and unfolding. We're exploring a lot of this in a future class, which I'll mention at the end of this one. So in many ways, it's all about little old us. It all begins and ends with us. The current disaster emerged from billions of erroneous decisions taken by the likes of you and me, taken over many years. And the solution will also emerge from billions of environmentally and socially responsible decisions taken by each of us, starting today over many years. And as we come to the end of this course, we want to reflect on the words of Patrick Geddes when he borrowed the phrase "Il faut cultiver son jardin" from Voltaire. And he said that peace means an unending fight against disease and slums, ignorance and economic injustice, against deforestation and waste of natural resources. Peace means, both concretely and figuratively, that everyone must cultivate his garden. He wrote this in the 1920s. See so how far ahead he was, because he saw peace as not just being a cessation of war against each other, but also about the improvement in public health, the improvement in justice, in economics, and particularly in environmental behavior. In other words, in not destroying our environment. Peace emerges from all of that. And then he says at the end that it's down to us to cultivate our own gardens. And if we do that, then peace will come, and so will so many other good things. And that is really where little old you and me can play our roles here, because that's the way it should be. It's individual decisions ultimately that will lead to change coming about. So in conclusion then, renewable energy can of course be a good thing. There's nothing wrong with reducing the terrible affliction of asthma. There's nothing wrong with preventing climate destabilization, floods and droughts, killing many people and destroying livelihoods. There's nothing wrong with having food on our table to eat. These are all good things. But currently it falls short. The technology needs to be re-investigated and needs to be contextualized within the Earth system, most fundamentally. It's not biomimicry, but rather it's bioparticipation. And that needs to flavor all of us and all of what we do. For example, in things like suboptimality, allowing us to not have the intensity of energy production and therefore not having to have these crippling technologies that have such devastating effects across the world. We must demand change and we must be accountable, but we need the information to be accountable. However, we have to be accountable and looking for that information, and we need to demand it in order. That's part of accountability as well. We can't just say, oh, they didn't tell us, so we didn't know. But we need to find out. And it's the government's responsibility to give clear information and for businesses to be transparent in terms of their supply chains. Any technology claiming to contribute to a sustainable future must demonstrate ecological resonance in that it promotes the functionality and sovereignty of nature, and social resonance in that it promotes the functionality and sovereignty to society. Current renewable energy technologies clearly do not meet these high standards, but the changes can and must be delivered. We'll finish with this slide, reflecting on Thomas Berry's thinking on this. And he said that we needed a great transition, what he called the Ecozoic. And he wrote in 1999, from the period when humans were a disruptive force on the planet Earth to the period when humans became present to the planet in a manner that is mutually enhancing. That is the Ecozoic. And that is really the vision of a great man, and one that is fit for purpose for all of us. Look, thanks so much. It's been really wonderful to have you on board for this course. We're going to return now and have a really long period of discussion, and that will be great. And we can tease apart any of the issues that have come up along the way. I'll just say, just at this point, that I'll be running 2 more courses next year, February coming, and then in May, one on rewilding, Paradise Lost, Paradise Restored, which is a 4-week evening program on Wednesdays. And then in May, I'm running one called Indigenous Thinking and Our Search for a Sustainable Future. And that's based on a new paper that has just come out. So that's going to be hopefully an interesting thing as well. Another 4-week course on Wednesday evenings. So let's go back onto Zoom now, and we will start our discussion. Okay, thanks.